Pam Bondi walked into the courtroom with her head held high, case files clutched tightly against her chest. 20 years as a prosecutor had prepared her for tough battles, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold. Well, if it isn't Miss Bondi gracing us with her presence, Judge. Richard Montgomery's voice dripped with sarcasm as he looked down from his bench. I hope you've prepared something substantial today, unlike your last 3 appearances in my courtroom. The gallery fell silent. Several reporters exchanged glances, pens hovering over notepads. This wasn't just judicial strictness, this was personal. Pam's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. Your Honor, I'm fully prepared to present the state's case against Mr. Harrington. The judge smirked. We'll see about that. What Judge Montgomery didn't know was that Pam Bondi had walked into his courtroom with more than just the case files for today's hearing. She carried evidence that would shake the foundations of the justice system in their county, evidence that would wipe that smug smile off his face forever. Within hours, she would have him let out of his own courtroom in handcuffs. The case seemed straightforward enough. James Harrington, a wealthy real estate developer with powerful connections, stood accused of bribing city officials to bypass environmental regulations for his latest luxury condo project. The evidence was substantial financial records showing suspicious payments, incriminating emails, even testimony from a whistleblower inside Harrington's company. But something had felt off from the moment the case landed on Pam's desk. Judge Montgomery had been assigned to preside over the trial, and his reputation preceded him. Known for his harsh demeanor and conservative rulings, he was respected but feared in legal circles. What troubled Pam wasn't his strict reputation, it was his unusual ruling pattern in cases involving powerful defendants with political connections. Those cases seemed to disappear with startling regularity, dismissed on technicalities or procedural grounds that didn't quite add up. The courtroom was only half full that morning. A few reporters, some law students, and Harrington's expensive legal team occupied the front row. Harrington himself sat with perfect posture, his $500 suit and confident smile projecting an image of a man who knew he would walk free. The prosecution may begin, Judge Montgomery announced, not bothering to hide the boredom in his voice. Pam approached the podium. Your Honor, the state would like to present evidence demonstrating Mr. Harrington's systematic pattern of M. Bondi. The judge interrupted. I've reviewed your filing. I'm not convinced these supposed patterns are relevant to the specific charges. Stick to the facts of this case. Pam nodded respectfully. Of course, Your Honor. The facts of this case are precisely what I intend to present. She began methodically laying out the evidence, financial records showing irregular payments from Harrington's shell companies to accounts linked to city officials, emails between Harrington and his finance team discussing special arrangements for greasing the wheels just as she was building momentum. Judge Montgomery cut in again. Miss Bondi, is there an actual smoking gun in this presentation? Or are you just connecting dots that don't exist? The defense attorney chuckled, not even trying to hide his amusement. Pam felt her cheeks flush, but kept her composure. Your Honor, if you'll allow me to continue, the pattern becomes clear. When pattern, the judge mocked. This court deals in facts, Miss Bondi, not patterns. Perhaps the district attorney's office should consider assigning these high-profile cases to someone with a firmer grasp of evidence law. The insult hung in the air. A few gasps came from the gallery. Even Harrington's attorney looked uncomfortable at the judge's blatant disrespect. Pam took a deep breath. With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe my 20 years of experience speaks for itself. If you'll allow me to continue. Judge Montgomery waved his hand dismissively. But do try to get to something substantial before we all grow old in this courtroom. What the judge didn't realize was that Pam Bondi hadn't come alone. That day, seated quietly in the back of the courtroom, was Agent Marcus Torres from the FBI Public Corruption Unit. He wasn't there by chance. He was there because 6 months ago Pam had brought him her suspicions about Judge Montgomery's handling of cases involving powerful defendants, and what they had uncovered was far worse than anyone could have imagined. For the next hour, Pam fought an uphill battle. Every piece of evidence she presented was met with skepticism. or outright dismissal from Judge Montgomery. Your Honor, these bank records clearly show transfers of funds from Harrington Development to offshore accounts that later funneled money to officials responsible for approving permits. Judge Montgomery barely looked at the exhibits, circumstantial at best. Many businesses use offshore accounts for legitimate purposes. When she presented the testimony of Sarah Chen, a former accounting manager at Harrington's company, the judge was equally dismissive. Ms. Chen's testimony appears to be that of a disgruntled former employee. I'm not convinced of its reliability. Harrington's attorney, a slick man named Preston Williams, hardly needed to object. The judge was doing his work for him during a brief recess. Pam stepped into the hallway where Agent Torres was waiting. He's not even trying to hide it. Pam whispered, it's like he's daring me to call him out. Torres nodded grimly. Our timing needs to be perfect. If we move too soon, we risk the whole operation. And if we wait too long, Harrington walks. Pam countered back in the courtroom. The judge's hostility escalated when Pam attempted to introduce evidence of similar patterns in Harrington's previous developments. Judge Montgomery's patience finally snapped. Miss Bondi, he said, voice rising, I've indulged this fishing expedition long enough. This evidence is irrelevant to the charges at hand and potentially prejudicial. I'm excluding it all under Rule 403. Pam stood her ground. Your Honor, this evidence establishes a clear pattern of did I stutter, Miss Bondi, the judge's face reneged. Your so-called evidence is excluded. Perhaps if you'd spent more time in law school and less time in front of cameras, you'd understand basic evidentiary rules. The courtroom fell silent. Even Harrington's smug smile faltered at the judge's naked hostility. Pam Bondi stood perfectly still, absorbing the blow. 20 years of public service, hundreds of successful prosecutions, and this man was treating her like a first-year law student who'd wandered into the wrong classroom. But instead of showing anger, she simply nodded. I understand, Your Honor. The judge seemed almost disappointed by her composure. Good. Now, do you have anything of actual substance to present? Or should we all go home? Pam gathered at her papers slowly. Actually, Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess to reorganize my presentation in light of your rulings. The judge scoffed. Fine, 20 minutes. But when we return, I expect something substantive, or I'm dismissing these charges. As the courtroom emptied for the recess, Pam nodded subtly to Agent Torres. It was time to put their plan into action. If you're finding this story of justice and corruption engaging, don't forget to like and subscribe for more compelling true stories that show the power of standing up for what's right. When court reconvened 20 minutes later, something had changed. Agent Torres was no longer sitting in the back row. Instead, he stood near the doors, speaking quietly into his radio. 2 other agents had joined him, their presence drawing curious glances from the gallery. Judge Montgomery banged his gavel. Miss Bondi, I hope you've used this time wisely. Pam approached the bench with a new folder in hand. I have, Your Honor. But before I continue with the state's case against Mr. Harrington, there's another matter I need to address. The judge raised an eyebrow. Another matter? This isn't a grocery store, Miss Bondi. You can't just add items to your cart. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the courtroom, but they quickly died as Pam placed the folder on the bench. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a series of recordings and financial transactions that have come to light during our investigation. The judge's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Recordings? What recordings? Conversations between Your Honor and Mr. Harris, dating back approximately 18 months. Conversations that took place in private, outside of your chambers, discussing the handling of this very case. The color drained from Judge Montgomery's face. For the first time since the trial began, he seemed at a loss for words. Harrington's attorney shot to his feet. Objection. This is completely inappropriate and irrelevant to the proceedings. Pam didn't flinch. On the contrary, it's directly relevant to whether these proceedings are being conducted fairly. The judge found his voice. Miss Bondi, Whatever you think you have, what I have, Your Honor, are recordings of you discussing how to handle this case with the defendant. I have financial records showing payments of $250,000 from an offshore account linked to Mr. Harrington to a shell company registered to your brother. In law, the courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Reporters were scribbling frantically, some already typing on their phones. Judge Montgomery's face had gone from pale to crimson. This is outrageous. I will hold you in contempt. Pam remained calm. You're welcome to try, Your Honor, but perhaps you should look at the documentation first. She gestured to Agent Torres, who approached the bench with another folder. As the judge flipped through the pages, his hands began to shake visibly. "These are fabricated," he whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. "They're not," Pam replied evenly, "and I believe you know that." She turned to address the stunned courtroom. "For the past 6 months, the FBI Public Corruption Unit has been investigating a pattern of judicial misconduct involving cases with high-profile defendants in this district. What began as a statistical anomaly, certain judges dismissing cases against powerful individuals at rates far above the norm, led to a deeper investigation. Judge Montgomery attempted to regain control. Miss Bondi, I am ordering you to stop this instant. I'm afraid I can't do that, Your Honor," Pam replied, "because as of this morning, I'm not just acting as a state prosecutor. I've been temporarily deputized as a special assistant to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the specific purpose of this investigation." She nodded to Agent Torres, who approached the bench. Along with another agent, Richard Montgomery Torres announced formally, "You are under arrest for judicial misconduct, accepting bribes, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice." The second agent stepped forward with handcuffs. Judge Montgomery's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "This is absurd. You can't arrest a sitting judge in his own courtroom." "Actually," Pam countered, "when that judge has abused his position and violated federal law, we can. And we are." As the agents moved to handcuff him, Judge Mon looked wildly around the courtroom, his eyes finally settling on Harrington, who was already being approached by 2 other agents. "You said this was handled." The judge shouted at Harrington. "You promised me." The outburst was the final nail in his coffin. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the man who had mere hours ago been the embodiment of judicial authority was read his Miranda rights and led away in handcuffs. Pam Bondi remained at the prosecution table, watching as the man who had belittled and insulted her was escorted from his own courtroom. She felt no joy, no triumph, only a deep sense that justice long delayed was finally being served. The aftermath of Judge Montgomery's arrest sent shock waves through the legal community. News vans lined the courthouse steps for days, and headlines across the country proclaimed the stunning fall of a respected judge. 1 week later, Pam Bondi sat in her office reviewing the case files. The investigation had expanded significantly. 3 other judges were under scrutiny, and Harrington had begun cooperating with authorities, naming names in exchange for leniency. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. It was District Attorney Robert Chen. "The U.S. Attorney wanted me to personally deliver this," he said, placing a letter on her desk. "They're impressed with your work on the Montgomery case." Pam nodded. "It wasn't just me. Agent Torres and his team did the heavy lifting. But you were the one who noticed the pattern in the first place," Chen pointed out. "And you were the one who stood in that courtroom and faced Montgomery down despite his attempts to humiliate you." Pam smiled faintly. 20 years of prosecuting has taught me something about bull. They're usually hiding something." The doll leaned against her desk. "The Judicial Ethics Committee is in turmoil. They're reviewing every case Montgomery ever presided over. It's going to be years of work." "Good," Pam said firmly. "Every defendant deserves a fair trial. If they didn't get one because of Montgomery's corruption, those cases need to be revisited." Chen studied her for a moment. "You know, when you first came to me with your suspicions, I thought you were overreaching. A respected judge on the take, it seemed far-fetched." "That's exactly what Montgomery was counting on," Pam replied. "His position as a judge was his shield. Who would question him? Who would dare suggest he was corrupt?" She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the courthouse across the street. The system only works when everyone is accountable. No one should be above the law, especially not those entrusted to uphold it. Chen nodded thoughtfully. The press is clamoring for an interview. They're calling you the judge hunter now. Pam shook her head. I'm not interested in publicity. I'm interested in justice. Well, justice has been served in this case thanks to you. Chen said. Montgomery is facing 20 years. Harrington is singing like a canary, and the other judges under investigation are lawyering up as we speak. As Chen left her office, Pam returned to the case files on her desk. There was still so much work to do. The corruption had spread far and wide, and rooting it out would take time and dedication, but she was ready for the challenge, because if there was one lesson to be learned from Judge Montgomery's downfall, it was that no position of power could shield someone from accountability. Forever truth had a way of coming to light, and justice, however delayed, would eventually be served in the end. Judge Montgomery's greatest mistake wasn't taking bribes or perverting justice. It was underestimating the prosecutor standing before him. The prosecutor he thought he could insult and intimidate into silence, the same prosecutor who, with quiet determination and unwavering principles, had brought his corrupt empire crashing down around him that evening. As Pam packed up her briefcase to head home, her phone chimed with a text from Agent Torres. Turn on Channel 5. She clicked on the small TV in her office, just in time to see footage of Judge Montgomery being led into the federal courthouse for his arraignment, his face ashen, his hands cuffed behind his back. The news anchor's voice was solemn in a stunning development that has rocked the legal community. Judge Richard Montgomery appeared in federal court today to face charges of judicial corruption. The investigation, spearheaded by veteran prosecutor Pam Bondi, has already uncovered evidence of systematic bribery and corruption reaching the highest levels of our judicial system. Pam turned off the TV. This wasn't about headlines or glory. It was about something far more important: restoring faith in a system that had been compromised by greed and arrogance. As she left the office, she passed a young prosecutor working late on a case. Miss Bondi, the young woman called out, I just wanted to say what you did with the Montgomery case. It's why I became a prosecutor. Pam smiled. Remember one thing, the law applies to everyone, no exceptions. And that was the lesson Judge Montgomery had learned to the hard way, a lesson that would echo through courtrooms for years to come. If you found this story of justice and accountability inspiring, please don't forget to like and subscribe for more content.